This is an introduction to our 1978 911 SC Targa. It's a special car for a number of reasons that I'm going to cover, but one of the key points that we're going to get into, and I might as well state it up front, is that this is a build that in my opinion is a good example of where I believe the market is headed. One, it's a G series, so this is a car that's got the obvious impact bumpers front and rear. The range, or the G series range, has for quite some time kind of been the second cousin to the really more desirable F series, and yeah, there's definitely a lot of merit in the earlier cars, but these G series cars have really come into their own, and the market, I believe, is hotting up per se toward them rapidly, for a number of reasons. Drivability, practicality, and just overall, let's call it, I guess, appeal, given, let's call it, the fact that they are now fully into classic territory. This car is 43, 44 years old, and it's definitely a car that you can, drive on a daily basis. So one, yes, this is a G series, that's a Targa, but the point that I want to land is that this is not just a car that's been kind of refurbished per se. It's a car that has been 100% rebuilt, and it is effectively a concourse level rebuild or restoration of a vehicle that is 100% drivable in contemporary terms, and can be driven comfortably to any number of kilometers that you wish. So to put that into perspective, the car had just over 300,000 kilometers when we bought it. A very good donor vehicle, full numbers matching, obviously, paperwork, service history on the car, which we can have a look at a little later if we need to. The car was a very good donor car, and yet we still, in rebuilding this car, replaced, or the new parts list was hit the 500 mark. So 500 odd new parts went into this car, and that's from a fully drivable, fully usable donor vehicle. Now you might ask yourself why, and the answer to that is that if you want a car to be 100% perfect, you have to build it perfectly, to state the obvious. But so there are mechanical and electrical components inside these vehicles that are obviously 40 odd years old, and whilst they may still operate and work, simply aesthetically refurbishing them is not enough. So you end up rebuilding every aspect of this vehicle, every nut, every bolt, and you replace what cannot be fully, let's call it, refurbished functionally as well as aesthetically. What you end up with then is a new 43, 44-year-old car. Now, what is special about a new 40-odd-year-old car? Well, the first thing is the donor vehicle had 300,000 k's in it. This car's been rebuilt. It now has effectively, although we do not change odometers, 0 kilometers on it. You can drive it for another 300,000-400,000 kilometers. For you to find or to own a classic 911 that is in this condition, that hasn't been refurbished, to use a term, you'd have to find an incredibly low mileage, perfectly looked after vehicle. And what that comes with is the angst of not being able to drive a low mileage classic vehicle. The second thing is that there are aspects of any vehicle that's 40 years old, even if perfectly looked after, that simply get old and deteriorate with age. So, it's not just about mechanical usage and mileage, it's about simple age and deterioration. So we replace everything. So you'll see some images coming through of kind of what the car looked like initially when we bought it. Very presentable, and everything that we did. So mechanically, electrically, aesthetically, everything rebuilt to 100% concourse Porsche OEM standard. It is a time-consuming and, yes, an expensive process. But what you get at the end of it is a new old car in the truest sense of the word. And that is what makes this car and the kind of cars which we're building currently incredibly special. They are brand new but old cars. So what you've got is, everything inside them is just as they came off the factory floor. Every bolt, every nut, every seal, I can run out of fancy words to describe what this car is in terms of its newness. We'll get inside later, is new. Put 500,000 k's on it if you want. And that's what you get. There's something else about the direction we've taken, which is we don't just fully restore. We also then provide very considered what we call upgrades. Aesthetically we'll come to last, but performance-wise, the early G series, the 2.7s, good cars. We'll get to those in a separate video. But the first of the SCs, the 7879, 3-litre motor, they run like tanks, but you're looking at around 177 odd horsepower, 180 horsepower fresh off the block. That gets somewhat challenging to drive in today's terms, just in terms of pure performance. Absolutely nippy. You can be quite comfortable driving them, but technology has moved on. So what we do is we do upgrade. At least we provide the option for our clients to upgrade these motors using the same displacement, 3 litres, but we will look at uprating the compression, and that uprated compression along with a custom cam and a few other little tweaks which we make or do. Let's open up and have a look, shall we? Leads to a motor that's got an unbelievable kind of smooth torque curve. So you end up with, in the region of just north of 215, between 215 and 220 horsepower coming out of this motor, and it comes alive beautifully around the 3000 rev mark, but it's perky from the start. So you get this wonderful thrust out of a classic vehicle that allows you to certainly drive it as fast as the fine that you're prepared to pay. And in some countries that means losing your car, so speed is very relative. But what we'll do is we'll build a car to be 100% concourse, and inside it put in 1 or 2 considered upgrades which then make it just so much better. This motor specifically, obviously aesthetically, it's beautiful and it's new and everything, and it is 100% replaced. Things like obviously airbox covers and all the mechanics and so on. The full rebuild, you might see some images now, performance wise, but the engine has been blueprinted as well. So what that comes down to is, well, in simple terms, every single moving part within that motor is balanced, shimmed, basically kind of balanced out in such a way that it works and runs in an absolutely fully balanced fashion. This motor runs like a sewing machine, and yet it'll push out 220 horsepower. What that leads to is an incredible driving experience in terms of simply, being able to push her when you want to. Fuel consumption remains very normal, very kind of within the normal realms, and you get a drive that is unbelievably smooth. Smoother, I would argue, that certainly smoother than she ever was when she left the factory floor. So what I'm really getting to is, performance-wise, we will make the only kind of stepping outside of pure, let's call it original OEM territory, considered upgrades to the motor. Nothing extreme, just enough to give these cars a lot of oomph. You're still going to get beaten by a VW Polo GTI, but that's really not the point, is it? The point is you'll keep up and do whatever top speed it is that you're comfortable doing, and you'll get there very quickly. You'll certainly get the kids to school on time, and there is enough room for them in the back. So back to the original point. Yes, car is 100% Porsche OEM rebuilt, so that it is 100% reliable, it is 100% safe, and it'll run and take you anywhere. It's good for many hundreds of thousands of kilometers that you can drive with no guilt whatsoever. You will get there faster based on some performance upgrades, but let's talk about the obvious kind of difference here, which is making these cars just slightly unique. And that's obviously where we work very closely with our customers to choose color schemes and little tweaks that kind of bring through a degree of individuality. So the exterior color, you'll notice here that there's what you could call a warm gray, but look what happens to that gray as soon as I introduce the green, and then what you're looking at is effectively a gray green. It's remarkable how the eye works, which is a primary color over here, which is in the roof, starts to pull out the green, which is obviously well embedded within the gray, and yet when you take the roof away, the color starts to look gray again. So that's an extremely well considered color. In fact, it was mixed to match our tan leather scheme. It's not something which is particularly unusual for us from a car point of view. We don't only build our interiors in tan, but we very much like a specific type of tan for many of our classic cars. So we start with the tan color, and then we mix our primary paint color in such a way that it corresponds perfectly with the silvers, or the brights as we call them, the blacks. And then, yes, we put in certain cases, some interesting roofs. Now, the client or the customer for this car, very special customer, without giving too much away, one of the senior executives within the broader VW group. It's heading back to Frankfurt, which is interesting because the car in fact was delivered initially in 1978 to Frankfurt, then came out to South Africa, spent its life here. We have a full service history on the car, and in fact it's being shipped back to Frankfurt, and we'll probably spend a few days in Wolfsburg under the hands of the new owner, who certainly knows a lot about cars. So a little feather, I guess, in our cap in terms of taking a humble little 911 that spent its life in South Africa, and it's going back in the hands of one of the senior executives of the holding company of Porsche globally. So, but forgive me, I'm just particularly proud of that point. It's a great little car. Let's go inside and then we'll talk about aesthetics. So inside, yes, our standard, kind of interior rebuild. We like to keep things very simple. Let's call it, well, simple being understated, perhaps is the word to use. The leather, as I've mentioned, a specific punching, which is a Porsche punching. We don't use a contrasting stitch. Our carpet colors are, got sufficient texture without being too knobbly, trying to be too much like a 356. And then, I guess what we try to do is then maximize the classic aesthetic of the earlier cars which we built. So let's talk about that for a second. Back in 1978, when the SC was initially launched, it was offered with what they call bright trim. So the SC, or the 911S, which is the 2.7 that came up before it, between 74 and 77 effectively, came with bright trim. That's now the chrome around the windows, the window frames, and around the headlight covers, and the beading, as we call it. And those cars, are the same trim then as the F series before them. And that silver or bright trim was offered as standard on the 78 and on the 79. In 79, you had the option to spec what they called the black pack, so you could remove the bright trimming and go black. And from the end of 79, you no longer had the option. It was then a standard, and you could no longer get the bright. So from 1980 onwards, the 911s would then carry black trim. As soon as these cars carry a silver trim, they simply become more, significantly more classic. So, we quite like the early 78, 79s for that reason. But yet, if we build a later car in 80, 81, it won't bother us too much to take them back to their original bright, by way of polishing and, getting them back to stainless steel. So aesthetically, she carries her bright trimming. She carries 6 and 7J Fuchs. You'll notice, if you're into that level of detail, the 6J profile in the front is obviously the narrow profile. You could also have gone 7s and 8s, but again, the early cars to me don't need massive amounts of rubber that they swing around. So what we've got is the narrow profiles, which I quite like, and in fact we've also gone for the narrower tire combo as well. So these are in fact 195s versus 205s, and on the back, we've got the complementing, a size which then complements, which is the 205s. So the car's got, I don't know, let's call it what it is, relatively narrow wheels, but just look how much more classic that car then presents with these beautiful little, as they were intended when they came out, narrow wheels. To that point, there is a trend which I hope will shortly come to an end of widening, wherever possible, widening these 911s, putting, wings on them, and I don't know, all sorts of aero, maximizing the amount of tire or rubber that they put down. I'm in fact going very much in the opposite direction. We've got cars which were in fact narrowing back down to their original kind of, let's call them, narrowness at the rear. There's a certain beauty, I believe, to the rear of a 911 when it's kept, into its original, let's call it, design. So we do not widen cars. We've done it once for a very specific purpose, and going forward now we're certainly stepping away from the need to widen any car whatsoever. So she is, as she was intended, with the G series rear fender, slightly narrower on the early series, and certainly narrower before that when you get to the likes of the E series. Anyway, so she's on Fuchs, OEM standard at the time. We've done it with the earlier Fuchs pattern, also just a little creative trick just to kind of get the car to present as classic as possible. But everything else, not everything else, but everything is fundamentally 100% OEM. What we'll do is take a little drive in the car, just to get an idea of what the driving experience is like. And yeah, my view on that generally is that, well, let's take a drive and you be the judge. Okay, so let's take you for a quick drive. Point out one or two highlights. To state the obvious, standard 915 gearbox, obviously fully rebuilt. I quite like the 915 boxes. The 905s are a little bit loose, the earlier ones. The 915s I find to be quite appropriate to the kind of driving style that a G Series gives. The G50 is certainly, in terms of high performance, a very capable box, but I just feel it kind of takes a little bit away from the classic feel of a 911. So the 915, absolutely great. Kept standard gearing in this car. No need to mess with gearing in a 915 box for this type of car at all. The usual warm-up regulator. Car starts first time. Runs beautifully smoothly. As mentioned, the motor's been fully rebuilt and blueprinted. So what you get for that is extremely smooth running motor, which, well, I can obviously feel, but you can't, but you can possibly hear. She runs really beautifully. Okay, in terms of compression, well, let's take it for a quick drive, shall we? We've got slightly raised compression in this car. We do one of two. We do like just above 10 and just above 11 in certain cases for some of our very high performance cars. This car is sitting in the mid-10s with a custom cam. So let's give her a go and you'll see what I mean by kind of a good torque feel. So let's give her a good run and off we go. Quickly gain speed, 5,000 revs, beautiful feel. We're now at 100 k's an hour. Off we go. We're cruising. The Targas, as you can hear, a little bit of air noise coming around the hood. Very standard, very normal. But the feel of this car is just unbelievable. Tight in terms of suspension. We like a slightly more kind of aggressive suspension setup. Just kind of lets us sit a little bit more solidly on the road, and that gives us this kind of great balance. Right, we're over the speed humps, let's go again. So here we are, second gear. I can put my foot flat, 5,500 revs, and we're off. We're into third. Let's take some twisties. Let's not go too fast, it is my client's car. Solid, planted, fully drivable, very easy to drive, and yet very responsive. You know you're in a classic car, but you don't have that nervousness that's attached to feeling in a classic car. Obviously, you know, OEM Porsche disc brakes all round. This car comes to a very rapid halt if you wanted to, but the drive itself is just remarkable. I'm now sitting at 3,000 revs in fifth. We're doing 130 k's an hour, and I could do this all day. All day. Okay. I guess this is really what Targas are all about. There's that perfect hour just before the sun sets. Call it Targa hour. This is what it's like. So let's talk about that, shall we? Which is kind of Coupe versus Targa. You know, it's just, to a great extent, it's much kind of a degree of preference. But you know, there's the Coupes are, you know, from a collector point of view, have always kind of held a bit of a premium. More so probably due to performance kind of capabilities. They're a little bit lighter. Obviously got a slightly more rigid body. But my view, and I've owned kind of two Targas, which I've, over the course of kind of history, sold. I've only recently bought another, and I bought a G Series Targa, which I'm keeping for myself. But there's something extremely special about a Targa. It's one, it's a unique model in as much as it's not a cabriolet, it's not a hardtop, it's a Targa, and across all the different brands, that's what you get the benefit of. You have a specific and a unique vehicle type, which I quite like. In terms of driving a Targa, you know, it literally has the best of both worlds. It's what Porsche kind of set out to do, which is they set out to build this car that kind of had the ability to open its roof, but still felt like a full coupe. And that's very much what you get. So here we are driving top down, the sun's going down. I don't know, my hair's barely moving. We could be doing a lot faster. I'm just not allowed to do that kind of speed here. And you get the benefit of a cabriolet, and yet let's call it almost the feel of a coupe. We did a test drive, in fact, with the client of this car, and he even noted, he said it's remarkable how, even with the top off, this car still feels, well, one, you feel very safe, and you just kind of have that feeling of kind of being enclosed, which is wonderful, and yet, you know, totally free. So, you know, is coupe better than Targa? Targa better than coupe? Obviously, there's no simple answer to that. If you're wanting out performance, sure, you know, the coupes, I think, are better suited to that. We don't build high performance Targas. I don't really see the point. But if you're wanting a unique vehicle, especially within a collection, if you're in that fortunate position, you know, there's nothing, in my opinion, or rather, you know, you cannot not have a Targa if at all possible. If you're wanting to kind of enjoy the car in all sorts of weather, a coupe obviously doesn't stop you from doing that, but you know, look what we're doing here. It is a remarkable feeling. You can obviously push the sunroof back in a coupe, but it still isn't the same as this. So, you know, I must be honest, I have an extremely soft spot for Targas. We're building a number of them at the moment. It's funny, they go in runs. You know, there are the guys with the foresight order them, and then, you know, a year and a half later they drive them away, and everybody suddenly wants Targas. And we definitely are in one of those waves at the moment where we're building 3-4 Targas at any given time, or rather at the current time, and that's wonderful. But my advice to anybody, especially if you own a coupe, you have to get a Targa. And if you're getting for the first time into these 911s, there's something extremely special about a G Series Targa. Well, all of them, to be honest. I just think the G Series in its own right, as we've spoken about, has its merits, but there's something about you know, the earlier cars done right, get the opportunity to drive like this. So you know, that's what it's like to drive a Targa. Okay, so we've taken a drive in the car, and you can get a kind of a clear sense of what it feels like it's going to be able to drive, let's call it in a spirited fashion, in a classic 911. Beautiful driving vehicle. Just to add, by the way, in terms of the setup of our car, setup being how the corner weights are set up, how low she sits effectively, front and rear, and how we balance that out. We like cars that are relatively, let's call it aggressive, not overly so. They're not knuckle draggers, but you know, it's got enough room for you to be able to take on a speed bump at speed. But when we tighten up the suspension and lower them, obviously, it's just a simple setting within the original factory options that you get. The suspension itself stiffens up and it gives you a really solid drive. There's quite a bit of rubber in terms of, you know, obviously the profile on these earlier spec of tires, which leads then to this wonderful kind of stiff, relatively stiff car with quite a bit of rubber, which gives you comfort on the road, so you're not kind of knocking your kidneys about, and yet, you know, you've got a stiff feel, but you know, you're not hurting yourself in terms of being too stiff. We quite like that let's call it balance. And other than that, I guess all we can really add is that these cars are obviously becoming more and more hard to come by. There are, you know, very few very good ones around, and you know, my advice to anybody that's looking, you know, to kind of enter the 911 market, this used to be the easier access point, much like the 964s used to be the easiest access point until suddenly they became unavailable and now are one of the more difficult access points. The G Series, in kind of historical terms, has been the easier access point. I'm afraid those days are now over. We don't have any cheap, let's call them G Series cars, which run from 74 through to 88 available. I don't think. If you get one, and you're lucky, but they do present immense value, just in terms of the fact that they're still, and becoming more so, appreciated for their aesthetic, their classic aesthetic, their drive. I believe that there's a slightly younger profile of driver that's appreciating the G Series, just because the cost of the F Series has become so high. More of a hedge fund trader type, kind of buyer, and all that. That's just part of trend and taste. F Series are beautiful cars, but they are somewhat pricey to start with. The G Series, I believe, are growing faster in value than the F Series. Neither of them, unfortunately, unfortunately, depending which side of the market you're in. Neither are getting cheaper. They're only becoming more and more expensive. But the G Series presents immense value: comfort, drive, reliability, safety. And in my opinion, kind of an ever-growing, iconic vehicle to, drive forever. Where electric takes us is going to be an interesting debate. My view on that is much like the steel watch industry. When Apple introduced when Apple introduced their watch series, everyone thought that was the end of the Swiss watch kind of industry, and it turned out to be much the reverse, where there's been a massive growth in specifically the iconic steel watches, the likes of the Rolexes and the Omegas and so on. The 911 is obviously a good example of what could be deemed to be an iconic internal combustion vehicle, and I believe that they'll become infinitely more collectible. Obviously, this comes from a guy who owns or kind of is in this business, so take everything I say with a pinch of salt, I guess. But I think it's quite safe to say that the 911s will only continue in their kind of value curve based on all the factors that surround them. So thank you very much for watching, and yeah, we'll be in touch more with a few more of these models which we're pushing out shortly, and I'm sure we'll spend a bit more time with the coupes as well.